It brings indescribable sadness to know contributed significantly to her fear, paranoia, and isolation.
Prince William had entered the meeting expecting numbers, valuations, and another routine briefing about the duchy's future. Instead, one sentence from the senior accountant stopped the room cold. Buried inside generations of protected holdings was something William had never been told existed: a privately maintained reserve of physical gold, shielded from ordinary estate accounting. But the greater shock was still coming. According to the inheritance structure placed before him, that reserve was not ultimately intended for William. It belonged to George. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. William stared at the figures without speaking. The Duchy of Cornwall was not simply a collection of farms, properties, rents, and commercial interests. It was a hereditary estate designed to provide income and financial support to the heir to the throne. Yet the accountants were now telling him that a far older layer of protected wealth had been kept separate from ordinary operating accounts. During this closed financial briefing, they confirmed exactly what had been uncovered. A concealed historical reserve of physical gold existed under a protected succession structure, and the person named to inherit it eventually was Prince George. William leaned forward and asked the lead accountant to repeat the beneficiary's name. The answer came back without hesitation: George. For a moment, the prince seemed convinced there had been some mistake in the wording. Catherine, briefed alongside him on the implications, immediately understood why his reaction was so sharp. Their son had apparently been placed at the center of a financial decision made years before either parent had been told such a reserve even existed. Catherine felt the weight of that immediately. The revelation sounded like extraordinary security for George, but it also meant earlier generations had made a serious decision about his future without consulting the parents who would raise him. William's concern deepened when the accountants explained that the gold had never appeared in the duchy's normal public-facing valuation. It had been preserved under a legacy structure, meaning a separate arrangement created specifically to protect certain assets across generations, rather than treat them as ordinary estate wealth. William then reached the clause that changed everything. A sealed succession instruction prevented him from folding the reserve into his own unrestricted duchy assets. He could oversee its protection and ensure the rules were followed, but he could not simply sell, spend, or redirect it. The future king was being asked to guard wealth meant for his son, while being denied the normal authority of ownership. William placed both palms flat against the table. The shock had hardened into something more personal now, because this was no longer about bullion or accountancy. He looked directly at the senior accountant and asked, "Who decided George should receive something I was never told existed?" The answer pushed the entire story backward, to a decision made long before William inherited the duchy. And once he discovered whose hand had shaped that decision, the gold itself became almost secondary, because the inheritance was really a message from one generation of the monarchy to another. To an outsider, the revelation sounded like extraordinary privilege. A young prince, destined to inherit an untouched reserve of royal gold. To William, it felt dangerously different. George was still his son before he was an heir, and suddenly, an invisible burden had been placed years into the boy's future. Catherine understood the contradiction immediately. Wealth could protect him, but a secret inheritance tied to the crown could also decide something about his life before George was old enough to decide anything himself. William carried the question away from the accountants, but not the unease. George stood directly behind him in the line of succession, meaning the boy's future could never be separated completely from the expectations attached to kingship. Catherine knew that better than most. She had spent years trying to preserve ordinary rhythms around their children, even while knowing that one of them was being raised inside an institution that had already mapped out much of his public future. William admitted what truly bothered him once they were alone. It was not the value of the gold. It was the fact that someone had designed its destination in a way that seemed to move around him entirely. The prince could understand inherited duty, but this felt different. Someone from an earlier generation had decided that George should one day receive a protected reserve, and William had only learned about it after the structure was already beyond his control. Catherine listened carefully before answering. Her concern went straight to their son. She asked whether George would someday see the reserve as protection or as another burden placed on him by people he had never met. That question stayed between them, because both understood the same uncomfortable truth. Royal inheritance could look like privilege from the outside, while feeling like obligation from within. William soon discovered the reserve came with even tighter limits than he first understood. George would not gain access simply by becoming an adult. Its transfer was tied to a defined succession milestone, meaning a formal point connected to his future constitutional role, rather than an ordinary birthday or family inheritance. That made the gold something more than private wealth. It linked the reserve directly to the crown, and to the responsibilities waiting for him. Catherine then read the second provision. The gold was required to remain physically intact, except under extraordinary circumstances, threatening the duchy's stability or the future heir's ability to carry out his responsibilities. She paused, closed the briefing folder, and slowly pushed it away from William. Catherine looked at him and said they were asking the wrong question. Before they worried about what George would inherit, they needed to know why someone had believed a future monarch might someday need a private reserve that almost nobody could touch. William did not answer immediately. He already knew where the trail was leading. The explanation was not hidden in George's future at all. It was buried in the monarchy's past, and in one extraordinary royal confrontation that had quietly set this entire inheritance in motion. Every secret inheritance has a beginning, and this one began with an argument the family never expected future generations to uncover. Years before William received the duchy, a private disagreement erupted over whether historic assets should remain vulnerable to the personal decisions of each succeeding heir. The dispute became so intense that one senior royal demanded a permanent safeguard. What followed was not merely an accounting adjustment. It was the moment the gold was removed from ordinary control, and George's future inheritance was quietly born. Elizabeth had understood that the reserve was never ceremonial treasure. It had been accumulated across generations as a defensive financial shield, something designed to survive periods of pressure when land, income, or ordinary estate holdings might become vulnerable. Earlier custodians had feared that if every future heir held unrestricted authority, valuable legacy assets could slowly disappear through restructuring, emergency spending, or decisions that seemed sensible in one generation but damaging in the next. Charles remembered the meeting that changed everything. At a private succession discussion at Sandringham, advisors placed forward a proposal that would have allowed future duchy leadership to liquidate historic reserve assets during ordinary financial restructuring. A succession meeting was simply a closed discussion about how royal responsibilities and assets would pass from one generation to another. But this particular gathering became far more personal. Elizabeth challenged the proposal almost immediately. Charles argued that future heirs would need flexibility. He believed leadership meant having enough freedom to respond to circumstances no previous generation could predict. Elizabeth refused to accept that logic without limits. She insisted that some assets had to survive the preferences of whoever happened to control the duchy at the time. The disagreement sharpened when the monarch asked him whether stewardship meant possessing something or protecting it for someone who had not yet arrived. That question ended the debate. Elizabeth instructed advisors to draft a protected succession instrument, a binding arrangement designed to remove the gold from normal discretionary control and preserve it across generations. The structure did something even more extraordinary. Instead of naming the immediate heir as final beneficiary, It pointed toward a future second-generation successor, ensuring that the person guarding the reserve would not automatically be the person entitled to inherit it. Elizabeth received the completed document later and paused over the beneficiary mechanism before signing. The formula remained dormant for years, waiting for the succession pattern to become clear. Once William became Duke of Cornwall, the provision resolved exactly as intended. George became the future inheritor. William finally understood what had happened. His grandmother had not forgotten him. She had placed him deliberately in the middle. He would protect the gold, preserve the rules, and carry the responsibility. But he would never be able to claim the reserve as his own. That realization changed his question completely. William no longer wanted to know what the gold was worth. He wanted to know why Elizabeth had trusted him to protect it, while denying him the power to possess it. William did not send an aide. He did not allow accountants to explain it away. He went directly to Charles. What followed was not a constitutional meeting between a king and his heir, but a deeply personal confrontation between a father who had known about the arrangement and a son who had not. William arrived carrying the sealed summary in his hand. He left it on the table between them and asked one devastating question. "How long have you known?" Charles did not avoid the answer. He admitted that he had learned about the protected reserve years earlier while dealing with succession planning, though the daily details had never been under his direct control. Succession planning meant the formal preparation for how duties, property, and responsibilities pass from one royal generation to the next. His role had been custodial. He knew the mechanism existed, but he had been bound by Elizabeth's instruction and had no authority to change George's eventual position within it. William felt the anger rise again. He told his father that learning about such a significant inheritance from accountants made him feel as though everyone else had understood something about George's future before George's own father did. The prince could accept secrecy when national duty demanded it, but this concerned his son. That made the silence feel personal. Charles refused to apologize. He reminded William that some royal responsibilities survive precisely because each generation accepts restrictions imposed by the one before it. The king knew his answer would hurt, but he also knew Elizabeth had designed the delay deliberately. She wanted William to discover the arrangement only after he had inherited full responsibility for the duchy, when he could understand what guardianship really demanded, instead of reacting simply as someone who had been passed over. William stared at him as the deeper truth emerged. Charles explained that Elizabeth had feared periods of financial pressure could push even responsible heirs toward short-term decisions. She did not distrust one person. She distrusted circumstance. A future crisis, falling income, political pressure, or costly restructuring could make protected assets suddenly look expendable. Her answer had been simple: remove temptation from the hands of anyone powerful enough to act on it. William pushed his chair backward and walked toward the door. He stopped before reaching it. Charles remained seated, and for several seconds, neither father nor son spoke. Charles finally broke the silence. "She trusted you enough to tell you no." William absorbed the words without turning around. He now understood why the reserve was untouchable, but that understanding created an even bigger question. If he could not alter it, and Charles had never been able to alter it either, then someone, or something, possessed enough authority to restrain even the heir. The next answer would expose the machinery behind the gold and reveal that, this time, royal power belonged not to the person wearing the crown, but to the rules surrounding it. William was accustomed to responsibility, but this was something stranger, an inheritance connected to his own son that he could neither release, redirect, nor dissolve. The accountants now showed him why. Elizabeth had designed the reserve so that no single royal, not William, not Charles, not even George before the required moment, could simply order the gold moved. Control had been divided, and sitting across from William were the people whose signatures could stop the future king himself. William studied the authorization structure and immediately understood how carefully the barrier had been built. Movement of the protected bullion required approval from several independent custodial roles, meaning separate officials responsible for guarding the reserve and enforcing the conditions attached to it. One signature could begin a process, but no single person could complete it. The arrangement separated royal rank from actual control and forced each heir to behave as a steward rather than an absolute owner. William accepted the logic, but acceptance did not make it comfortable. He was responsible for the duchy, responsible for protecting its future, and responsible for the son who would eventually inherit the reserve. Yet when it came to this one asset, his authority stopped at the edge of rules written by someone else. The contradiction frustrated him because responsibility without total control could feel less like power and more like restraint. The senior duchy accountant shifted before speaking. He told William plainly that his professional duty would require him to reject any request that broke the conditions, even if that request came directly from the prince himself. The accountant did not sound defiant. He sounded uneasy. Still, he repeated the point because the structure depended on exactly that kind of resistance. William could request action. He could not command obedience where the document forbade it. William then learned how the reserve had remained hidden for so long. Small verification audits had taken place periodically, but the gold had never been folded into ordinary duchy presentations or standard operational reports. That separation meant generations of staff could work across the estate without ever seeing the full scale of what was being protected. William turned another page and found the one exception. Elizabeth had created an emergency clause, allowing the reserve to be used only if an extreme event threatened the heir's ability to preserve the duchy itself. The clause was not a loophole. It was a last defense, designed for circumstances serious enough to endanger the institution rather than merely inconvenience it. William lifted the authorization sheet and saw his signature line beneath those assigned to non-royal custodians. A short, disbelieving laugh escaped him. For once, his name alone was not enough. Then the accountant delivered the next shock. The reserve was about to undergo its first full succession audit under William. And once its true value was measured, keeping the secret contained would become far more difficult. The structure had survived quietly for years. But the moment its real scale emerged, silence began to crack, and the first consequences followed almost immediately. William believed the greatest shock was learning the reserve existed. He was wrong. The succession audit produced a valuation so substantial that the inheritance could no longer be dismissed as a symbolic cash from another era. It had become a major financial force in its own right, and with that number came a new fear. If knowledge of the reserve escaped the tiny circle protecting it, George would cease to be discussed merely as a young prince. He would become the center of an extraordinary inheritance story. William read the audit summary twice before speaking. Decades of appreciation had transformed the protected bullion into one of the most valuable individually designated legacy holdings connected to George's future. Its importance was not simply the size of the number. Gold carried another advantage that land, historic residences, and long-term property assets did not. Liquidity, meaning it could be turned into usable financial protection far more quickly during a genuine crisis. That made Elizabeth's safeguards suddenly feel even more deliberate. William's concern shifted immediately from the reserve to his son. He instructed the small circle of staff, aware of the audit, that George's daily life was not to change. No different treatment, no whispered attention, no sudden sense that the boy had become more important because adults had discovered the scale of something waiting in his future. The prince understood how quickly privilege could become identity, and he refused to let a hidden fortune define a child who had never asked for it. Catherine felt the same danger the moment William brought the updated valuation home. She read the figure once, then again, as though expecting the number to become less startling the second time. It did not. She folded the page closed and looked directly at him. He cannot grow up believing this is who he is. Her concern was not rejection of the inheritance. It was fear that George might one day confuse what he possessed with what he was worth. William then found the line that changed the meaning of the entire audit. Elizabeth had added a handwritten instruction, describing the reserve not as George's reward, but as his responsibility held in trust. A trust, in simple terms, meant something valuable being protected under rules for another person or future purpose, rather than handed over for unrestricted use. The wording made the intention unmistakable. William finally understood the burden hidden inside the blessing. George was not being invited to consume the reserve. He was being drawn into the same cycle of stewardship that had already frustrated his father. The gold promised security, but it also demanded restraint. Later, William listened as George spoke casually about an ordinary childhood concern, unaware that a sealed valuation carrying enormous consequences rested inside his father's locked desk, only rooms away. The contrast struck him harder than any number on the page. William knew the secret could no longer remain only between accountants and royals. Before he decided anything else, he had to speak privately with the person who would one day inherit it. For the first time, the story was moving beyond papers, advisors, and old instructions, because William now had to decide what a father should tell his son. There were no accountants in the room, no advisors, no palace officials explaining succession. Just William and George. The prince knew his son was still too young for balance sheets, legal restrictions, or the full weight of inherited royal duty. So he did not begin with money. He began with responsibility. William told George that something valuable had been protected for him long before either of them understood what it would mean, and then watched carefully to see how the boy reacted. William deliberately left the valuation out of the conversation. He believed George needed to understand the principle before he ever understood the scale. Inheritance, in this case, meant more than receiving wealth from an earlier generation. It meant accepting something already tied to rules, expectations, and future duty. The prince also made another decision in that moment. His son would not discover the truth years later from an accountant, a document, or a sudden briefing the way he had. William admitted that he had struggled when he first learned about the reserve. He told George that part of his anger came from feeling excluded, as though decisions had been made about his own family while he stood outside them. The confession mattered because he did not want the boy to grow up believing silence was simply part of royal life. If something would shape George's future, his father wanted him to understand why. George listened, then asked the question William had not prepared for. If the gold belonged to him one day, why was he not supposed to spend it? The simplicity of it unsettled the prince. There was no suspicion in the question, only logic. Yet answering it forced William to explain the lesson Elizabeth had built into the entire arrangement. William told him that some royal possessions belong less to the person holding them than to the future they are meant to protect. Elizabeth had believed that stewardship meant resisting the urge to treat every inherited asset as personal property. The Queen's principle now sounded different to him. For the first time, he understood that being bypassed had not been an insult. It had forced him to become the guardian before he could fully understand the lesson. George thought for a moment before asking, "So I look after it for whoever comes after me?" William paused. Then he answered yes. That small exchange broke something open inside him. Much of the anger he had carried since the first briefing finally loosened. George had understood in seconds what William had needed: days of documents, arguments, and uncomfortable truths to accept. But their private understanding was already becoming vulnerable. News of an unusual Duchy valuation had begun moving beyond the tight circle surrounding the reserve, and public attention was turning toward George. Inside the family, the inheritance had finally found meaning. Outside the palace walls, however, the gold was about to acquire an entirely different meaning. By morning, what had begun as a silent briefing behind closed doors had become a national obsession. The phrase was everywhere: George's secret gold reserve. Commentators debated its meaning, historians searched for precedents, and crowds arrived carrying phones instead of answers. Yet the image gripping Britain was not the metal itself. It was the thought of a young prince unknowingly carrying another piece of the monarchy's future, long before he could possibly understand its weight. William saw immediately how the story had changed once it left the family. Public discussions split between fascination with the reserve's value and deeper questions about how royal wealth, duty, and responsibility move from one generation to another. Palace communications remained deliberately restrained, avoiding language that might turn George into the center of a financial spectacle. That caution mattered, because the reserve was not ordinary spending money. It was a protected generational asset, wealth controlled by conditions rather than personal desire. William grew more frustrated with each headline. Several reports reduced the story to a simple idea: George had suddenly become vastly richer. The prince knew that framing ignored everything that mattered: the restrictions, the duty, and the fact that his son could not simply treat the reserve as personal fortune. To William, the difference was enormous. One version made George look privileged beyond measure. The other showed a child being prepared, quietly and far too early, for responsibility. Catherine worried about something even closer to home. She had only just helped William explain the inheritance carefully to their son, and now the outside world was attaching louder meanings to it. She feared George might see a headline before they could control the conversation around him. The boy had understood the reserve as something to protect. Catherine did not want public excitement to teach him instead that it was something to boast about. The debate shifted as commentators examined the structure more closely. They began emphasizing that the gold could not be freely spent and was tied to generational stewardship. Suddenly, the question changed. People were no longer asking only what George had received. They were asking why Elizabeth had believed future heirs might need something protected even from their own immediate control. Then one fictional morning edition captured the frenzy in a single front page: The Golden Heir, Elizabeth's secret legacy for George. Outside Buckingham Palace, visitors held copies above the barriers, while broadcasters spoke live behind them. The image turned a private family burden into a public symbol. William watched the coverage and accepted what secrecy could no longer do. It could protect the vault, but not the meaning surrounding it. Only one thing could do that now: the way George was raised to understand what he had inherited. The final choice would not concern the gold, the accountants, or the value attached to the reserve. It would concern what kind of man the monarchy intended George to become. In the end, the most important thing Elizabeth left George was not buried inside a protected vault. It was embedded in the rules surrounding it. William had begun this journey shocked that his own son could inherit something so valuable without his knowledge. He finished it understanding why the secret had been constructed that way. The reserve existed to survive individual desire, immediate pressure, and even the authority of powerful royals. Its true purpose was to teach every generation the same uncomfortable lesson: possession is temporary, stewardship is not. William finally accepted the restrictions without resistance. He confirmed that he would make no attempt to restructure the reserve for his own benefit, because he now understood that the rules were not designed to weaken his authority. They were designed to protect the asset from authority itself. Inside the family, George's eventual inheritance was no longer being discussed as a private fortune. It had become a responsibility attached to succession, the transfer of royal duty and position from one generation to the next. William also saw Charles differently. The anger he had carried toward his father softened, Once he understood that the king's silence had protected Elizabeth's instruction, rather than concealed some judgment against him. Charles had known enough to preserve the structure, but he had also accepted the same limitation placed on everyone else. That realization allowed father and son to move beyond the confrontation that had divided them. Catherine held firmly to the principle that mattered most to her. George would grow up knowing the reserve existed, but it would never be allowed to define his worth, his childhood, or the kind of person he believed himself to be. She understood that extraordinary inheritance could become an emotional burden if a child was taught to measure himself by what waited for him rather than by what he chose to become. William finally understood Elizabeth's deeper design. She had not chosen George over him. She had deliberately placed William between the treasure and its future owner, so that both father and son would learn different sides of stewardship. Elizabeth created the protection. Charles preserved it. William would guard it. George would one day inherit the duty attached to it. 4 generations were now connected by the same rule. William returned the original succession document to its case. This time, he did not pause over the line naming George. He closed the cover, rested his hand on it for a moment, and told the accountant, "Keep it exactly as she intended." The shock was gone. William no longer saw the gold as wealth withheld from him or privilege handed to his son. He saw it as a test of character. George's greatest inheritance was never the power to possess something priceless. It was the obligation to preserve something he had never been meant to own selfishly. And that is why the secret gold reserve ultimately changed far more than George's financial future. It forced William to understand the monarchy exactly as Elizabeth intended, not as something one generation owns, but as something each generation must protect before handing it on. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.